Welcome to Wines and Wonders with Kirsten Fox. True stories with a side of wine. Looking for inspiration for your life and your wine glass? This is your podcast.
Hi guys, welcome back to Wines and Wonders. With a psalm and a shaman, Dannielle and I are so happy to have you back and here to talk about what's a challenging subject that we've tackled, especially at this time of year, if you happen to be listening around the holidays, because we are headed into Thanksgiving right now as we record this and headed into the holidays. But we are focusing on death and the processes that happen as someone gets older. We're not talking about death, unexpected death of a younger person. We're talking about death as an expected part of life and with an elder in your house. So we started this whole process, this whole season. Episode 1 was on the day it all changed. It was a focus on what happens when someone is given a diagnosis that at the end of their life may or probably will spell death. And so what happens to the person? What happens to the family? And how is that received? And how can we as, currently, as a person that's on the younger end of the spectrum with older parents right now, how do we perhaps deal with these kinds of stresses in our lives in order to support the elderly folks that we may be dealing with? So we talked about that. We went through some helpful tools that Dannielle has for us to help ourselves deal with what we're hearing about someone we dearly love in our lives. And then also having not only your own life to manage, but having the addition of an elder person in your life who may now become a dependent in your world. So anyway, that was the day it all changed. That's episode 1. So Dannielle, hello.
Yes.
And welcome again today.
Thanks. Here we are. The day before Thanksgiving, that's where we are today. So happy Thanksgiving. And I hope you all had a great Thanksgiving because you'll probably be listening to this afterwards. Yes. So then we talked about on episode 2, we talked about the right to die. And that was an episode where we went through those places where some states in our country have the option to have doctor-assisted death and what happens in the case of family members who get diagnosed with dementia, Alzheimer's, or those kinds of diagnoses where it's not a 6-month terminal diagnosis, and where are their choices? Where are their options in right to die? And as we discussed in that episode, there really aren't any. And so we had that conversation of where can the needle start to move, or how can we assist people who choose to not want to be caught in a long-term slow decline. And we talked about your mom, who was such a brave and courageous example of realizing that she did not want to be in that situation. And today we're going to talk about the loss of independence. So following this track in our topic of conversation, the place where what happens when our family members, our loved ones, come to that place where they recognize that the decline in the state of their well-being actually creates loss of independence, where they're no longer able to drive themselves, or they're no longer to take care of themselves at home if they're living by themselves, or to make medical decisions, to make financial decisions, and those day-to-day things, those simple things. So what happens when we come to that place where we as the family members recognize that our parents or whomever the relation may be, all of a sudden has lost that day-to-day independence. And we recognize the signs of them needing help, that they're no longer in that place where every day is just a normal day.
And I will add that you and I have decided that we're splitting this loss of independence into 2 episodes, because the majority of Americans at this time technically avoid looking at the loss of independence, whether it's from the family's perspective or the elderly person's perspective. So we're calling that today, this is the episode we're talking about the hard way. This is loss of independence the hard way, with basically trying to avoid the decisions as we go forward.
Yeah. Trying to avoid it, and or coming to that place where it's really hard to accept it, right? Which leads us into avoidance, but there's a really interesting nuance in there, because sometimes we actually put the blinders on where we won't even accept it, either as the child of the parent and or the person who's going through it themselves, where they're in that place of denial, and it's almost like it's a safety mechanism, because it's part of identity. And when they come to that place of the loss of independence, it actually can strike that nerve of loss of identity as well.
Well, as I looked into the research on this topic, and I mean, it is overwhelming in terms of the numbers, that more often than not, the elderly are first the ones to try to hide their failings. They go through anger, guilt, fear, depression. They are, as we have a whole society here in the United States based on, give me freedom or give me death. We are steeped in a world of independence, and we've lived our whole lives, many of us taking pride in being independent and alone. A recent study, so from 2018, it was conducted by the Home Instead Senior Care Network, and it identified the top 10 things that seniors over 55 fear most. Now, the fact that they just called me a senior makes me want to hurl. I'm like, so there I am already, like right here going, anger? Are you kidding me?
You're already ticking one of the boxes.
Are you serious? I'm 55, I'm 57 and you're calling me a senior? Jeez. So anyway, right there, I'm already, prickling. But interestingly, if you look at the top 10 things, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the top 10 things that seniors fear most about getting older, 5 of them are about losing their independence. So so here is from the top down. Number 1, loss of independence. Number 2, declining health. Number 3, running out of money. Number 4, not being able to live at home. Now I have more stats on that as well as we get into this. So that's another one, loss of independence. Number 5, death of a spouse or other family member who means a lot to the elderly person. Number 6, here's another independence one, inability to manage their own activities of daily living. Number 7, independence related, not being able to drive. Number 8, isolation or loneliness. Number 9, this is the last independence related one, strangers caring for them. And number 10, fear of falling or getting hurt. So those are the top 10 that seniors over 55 fear most. to dive a little deeper into the not being able to live at home, because this is many times, this is the first thing that the family members become aware of, because of an experience hearing about the parent leaving a stove on, or the parent, not understanding and not locking the front door, and the child is visiting and realizes there's some kind of a safety mechanism that goes on, and it's not being observed at the house. And there was a study done back in 2007 called Aging in Place in America. And this is an old study, but really none of this has really changed. It's not like it's changed over the years, because what they did is they analyzed the fear of what elderly people and their families are feeling about the fear of being moved out of the primary residence. And 89% of elderly people fear having to move out of their home. 89%. I mean, basically 9 out of 10 are fearing this. And in fact, which I found so interesting, at the same time they asked about that and having to leave their home, they also asked the elderly person, are you afraid of dying? And only 3% of elderly people were actually afraid of dying. They were more afraid of being moved out of their home than they were by a long shot of dying. And then same study asked the children of the elderly person what they feared most. And it was about, so 82% of the children of the elderly person said they feared their parents moving into a facility would be mistreated there, or 89% of the children felt their parents would be sad in a new place out of their home. So these are some of the statistics that we've got as we look at dealing with the loss of independence, and particularly that big loss about moving out of the primary home. So that's what I found in terms of the research associated with that.
Did it talk about those places where, whether it was the elderly person who came to that decision for themselves, or was it the child of the elderly person who began to recognize the sign and says, Mom, I really think this is best for you to move into a facility?
These were all pre-move. These were all fear of.
Fear of, yes.
Versus actually happening.
Yeah.
In fact, my mom, who we'll talk about in the next episode, because she was, for the most part, she took this, the reins on this, and was proactive. But I will tell you that one of her reactions she was brave, but terribly fearful about leaving her home, and what living in a group setting independently was going to look like. And she said to me the first night she was in there, she was like, I can't believe I was so worried about this. Like, it's like going to camp. She's like, this was so fun. I've met some new friends. I don't have to worry about leaving my windows open because someone's going to break in because I'm there, protection here. I mean, it was like this relief, but the fear before that was huge. And that's what these studies are reflecting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The concept of looking at getting ahead of this, which we're going to talk about next episode, versus what happens when we end up being in the emergency state with, oh my gosh, I'm recognizing these signs, and all of a sudden now we have to do something about it. And when it gets to the point where you actually really need to make the action happen, versus how do we preempt it, right? And that place where the statistics show that 89%, was it, Kirsten, of the children of the elderly feared that their parents would be sad, right,
Yes.
if they had to go. And
Yes.
so this is that place where what happens when we come into this phase of our life as the child of the parent or the caretaker of our aunt or uncle. And you and I have a mutual friend where she was the primary caretaker of her grandfather, and that's
Right.
who her elderly person was. So, what happens for us when we begin to recognize the signs, and where do we take action and where do we not take action? Why do we take action? Why do we not take action? And these are some of the things that we can start to look at. We know that the elderly person, though, they fear their loss of independence, and so they may want to hide it a little bit. They may not want to let on that they're writing themselves notes to remember to feed their animals, or they're writing themselves notes so they remember where they put their car keys, or those kinds of things, right? We may stumble upon that as we visit them or have conversations with them. But there's that place where, what I want to contribute to this conversation that we're having today is for that self-reflection, to look at our own behavior as the caretaker or the child or the family member, and to start to recognize, where do we go into denial? Where do we go into that place where we're uncomfortable saying, Mom, we need to talk about what's happening, or Mom, I've been recognizing some of these signs. And part of it is that there's a role flip that happens. And Kirsten, you have spoken to this in our discussions, but when the child becomes the caretaker of the parent.
Absolutely. It is quite a change in everything. Maybe Dannielle, before we get into that, let's take a break, take a deep breath, and then we'll come back and talk about the person who is in the situation of a parent who is fearful of losing independence, and what you were just talking about in terms of that flip that goes on in a family when there's more of an emergency kind of realization that's going on. So stay tuned, you guys. We'll be right back and we'll continue this really important conversation.
Today's podcast is brought to you by my company, Uplift Gift, when words aren't enough. When I had cancer, friends sent me the most amazing, wonderful gifts and cards, and they were from their hearts, and they made me feel so comforted and loved. And at the time, I was writing a column for the Huffington Post on wine pairings called Wines to Pair with Life. And so I wrote a series of articles about wines to pair with breast cancer. So in my public in the public, purview, people started contacting me saying, what should I send my friends? What were the best gifts when someone gets bad news? And finally, I just heard, this message that said, this is what you need to do, Kirsten. This is your gift out of your cancer that you can give the rest of the world. So the company, again, is Uplift Gift, and we help you support your friends and loved ones who may be far away from you, who just are getting a divorce or are dealing with a parent dying or are struggling with a new diagnosis. I realized people need help talking to others who've been given bad news. Since I've been through that experience quite a few times in my life, I feel like the Uplift Gift series of gift boxes are a perfect fit to help you support your friends. Uplift Gift, when words aren't enough.
Welcome back to Wines and Wonders, inspiration for your life and your wine glass.
All right. Thanks for the break there, a little deep breath. And these are hard topics that we're examining in this season. And so, Dannielle, let's go back to what we just talked about. We were talking about an elderly person who's fearful of losing independence, not being able to live at home, inability to maybe get in the bathtub and worry about slipping, or not being able to drive, having strangers in their house taking care of them. They're trying to hold on to independence. And as children or nephews and nieces or grandchildren, we're trying to let them have that independence, but also have to eventually deal with this situation and what we do with it and what the parent or grandparent or such does with it. So let's move into that now. You were talking about some help and family emergency kind of things that you were heading into. What does that look like for you?
How I work with people when we find ourselves in this situation, or I work with a client who's coming into this situation, we talk about the recognition and the identification of the shift that's taking place in the relationship or the engagement between the two. So where most of our lives we're gonna stick with a parent-child dynamic. It's just easy to stay consistent, right? So most of our lives, our engagement with our parents is that they're the parent, we're the child. Now, as we grow up and we become adults, we have an adult child to parent relationship. So it shifts, it changes, obviously. And we operate that way for decades until there comes a point where we realize, wow, things are shifting here. And now I'm going to be assisting and caretaking my parent. And one way that we can work with that transition is to have the self-awareness to see that our engagement is changing, that it requires of us to recognize that one way of engagement is now changing, coming to an end, and another way of relating with our parent is emerging and coming into play, and to have that recognition that it's really one of those end phases and beginning phases in that. And when we can just presence it, a lot of times, Kirsten, just the awareness of presencing it can allow us to have a smoother transition. Do you have any stories or examples of how that process went for you?
Well, so when you're saying, what did you use? Presencing it?
Yeah.
Are you saying like voicing it? Is that what you're...
You can voice it within presencing it. It's really about presencing it within yourself, about coming to that own reflection with yourself of, okay, this is a shift that's happening. This is now a new engagement that I'm having with my parent that has not existed before. Because prior to this moment, my parent was functionally taking care of themselves. And now I'm stepping in and making sure that they are able to take care of themselves. Now, that could be through conversations with your friends. It can be through just your own self-awareness process. It can be through all of a sudden that moment where you are all of stepping in and caretaking, where you have that recognition of like, wow, okay, this is a different place. So it could be verbal. It can be an internal process. It's really about... It's so fascinating because these are subtle things that will happen, but when we develop the ability to observe and have a self-awareness practice with ourself, that's when in these moments that observer steps in and we can actually almost witness what is happening in real time.
I remember because you were helping me in terms of inner work through this, as I was learning that I was going to become my mom's caretaker. And I do remember having to process, I have 3 kids. I have a full-time job, if not for 3 businesses. Or I had 3 businesses at the time. And I mean, I remember thinking, how could there was anger at the situation that I had to process, because I was like, how do I even possibly add more to my plate? There was a bit of resentment that I was going to do this, and were my sisters stepping up as much, and all this kind of stuff in terms of inner sibling, communication and relationships. And I was actually later thankful of the time that we spent helping me process this new role that I was having to step into, because I think part of my ease at supporting my mom as we went through the process together, part of my ease was the fact that I had dealt with that change and was at peace with it, versus I've seen other friends, and possibly my, one of my sisters was in a position of more kind of putting her hands over the ears, blah, 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 blah. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to see it. I don't want to, know this. And it became more of an end. I mean, she went through the process of this grieving and such with our mom as she was losing her mind. She went through it her way. I went through it my way. I would tell you that, thank goodness I had a person in my life like you that helped me process it. Because I think in my world, I would have much preferred to process it the way, on my own time, on my own schedule, when I could take the time to look deeply and see where my stories were, versus getting hit with an emergency, more like other people that might, do more like my sister, which was blah, 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 I don't know, I don't want to see it, I don't want to see it. And, and it's more painful all at once. But really, truly, it's like, it's painful for whichever way you do it. And it's not, there's no right or wrong. I'm just glad the way I was able to process it with you helping me. So what are some other, so I know you've got tools that you used with me. And so what are some of those tools for kids that may be faced now with more of an emergency, more of the hard way of having a parent lose independence? What are some of your tools?
Mm-hmm. When it's more of that emergency where, like, all of a sudden something happens where there's that big recognition and there's a place where you're suddenly called to have to step in, versus, wow, mom just got diagnosed with this. I can see that life is going to change, right? You have a little more runway with that. And I think that's, where you and I were. There was a little more runway with you. Like, the diagnosis happened, you recognized this, and you began to work with it. And probably, if we're really honest with ourselves, most of us will see those signs coming, right? We as the kids, we've known our parents our whole life, and we start to see it. We start to recognize, like, I think, that happened. Yep, that definitely did happen. And so again, there's, this awareness piece, and this podcast that we're doing, this series this time around for this season, is having these conversations to begin to plant seeds for people, for recognizing that we're all going to come into this in some shape, way, or form. Not all of us are going to have parents who get diagnosed with dementia. Not all of us are going to have parents who have this kind of long, slow health condition. But we will at some point come to a place of recognizing that our parents need assistance one way or another. And so just bringing that in and helping us to recognize the signs when they show up. But to answer your question, what happens when all of a sudden that thing happens? There are, I would say, my advice to people would be, who can you talk to get some outside perspective on this? Because you're going to feel like you're you're operating in a fishbowl, and you're going to have a whole bunch of things happening internally that could be in conflict with each other. And it's really helpful to have an outside perspective, a therapist, a friend, a priest, a pastor, a shaman, whatever your version and your variety is that you feel called to, but to have that outlet where you can start to talk it out, where it's not just living all balled up inside. Because the points of conflict that can happen is, wow, I'm seeing this with my parent and I want to do something about it, but I don't want to hurt their feelings. I don't want to be the bad guy. I don't want to say something to them where they might be offended. I don't want to pull independence before it's necessary. Whatever those things are. And those are internal conflicts. Because on one hand, you're wanting to be helpful and you see something and you're wanting to be preemptive. And on another hand, you want to stay the child. You don't want to hurt feelings. You don't want to say something offensive. And so how do you begin to sort out that internal conflict? So some tools are,
Yeah. I'm sorry. I just want to recognize
that's okay.
how hard that is. That step and having someone to talk to, I think is a way to almost be able to get through it sane instead of insane.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah. So
right.
Really important.
Yeah. So, having that person. Again, like we said just a few minutes ago, recognizing the flip in the engagement. Now, here's another tool that I'm going to offer up to our listeners. The flip in the engagement, I'm going to bring this energetic component in, right? Because that's what I do with a som and a shaman. So the energetic component of recognizing that our engagement is changing is to actually let one engagement go so that we can come into another engagement. Now, how I work with this, there are different ways, Kirsten, that people can work with this where the language can change. So let's just recognize that I'm going to use the language that I use in my practice as a shamanic practitioner and dealing with ourselves as energetic beings. And that is that when we have a certain way that we engage with somebody, we end up having an energetic track. So think about it like a train on a track. There's a track and the train kind of moves down that track and it stays in that track and it says, this is how we go. We go in this direction. This is our next stop is at this station and this is what's happening. And it holds certain information. And the information says, my role is that I'm the kid. Your role is that you're the parent. My role is that I show up and do this. Your role is that you show up and do this. And these are those unspoken agreements, okay? Unspoken energetic agreements. Now, when all of a sudden that needs to change, we need to hop tracks. We need to take our train and we need to get it off the track that it's been on and we need to put it on another track. So there's a visual for you. But the way that we actually do this in recognizing ourselves energetically is we dissolve agreements energetically, or we dissolve cords of attachment. Now I'm going to give you guys the super fast Cliff Notes version of what this is. Our multidimensional energy bodies are made up of axiotonal fibers is what they're called, or light fibers. And what can happen is we develop a cord with another, and it looks like exactly what it sounds like. It's a cord. So if you could see energy, you would see that there's a line of light that goes from your body out and hooks up into another person's body. And that's our cord of attachment. It's like an umbilical cord, or it's our cord of behavioral patterns. And this could be a whole topic. We could do a whole season on that, right? But cord of behavioral patterns. And the beautiful thing is that when we bring awareness and consciousness to it, we can actually dissolve those cords of attachment and we can allow for a different cord of attachment to come into play. And this is super, super helpful when we find that our relationship with another is shifting and changing. And we can work with that ourselves.
Well, I remember doing with you. Now this was more recent. So you did a cord cutting ceremony with my adult son, and
Yes.
we had the family there, and
Yeah.
you talked about the exact what you're talking about, which is dissolving the cords that were the former child parent relationship, or even in the siblings that were there to be a part of it, and then allow for new cords to form based on an adult son and adult parents and such. And so that was a beautiful experience. And it's more natural to be a parent watching that and see a child coming into their own and be much more supportive of that than, some of the challenges we're seeing, that we would feel when we're talking about the other side of this, which is the child cutting the parent cord and becoming the caretaker of the parent, which is what you're talking about right now. But it is helpful. It was certainly helpful to redefine and to talk about a new track like you're talking about.
Yes. Yeah. And to redefine the relationship, that is such a great way to sum it up. And that's what we're doing. We're redefining the relationship. And to redefine the relationship, there's different levels of engagement. So we can name it. That's a mental, emotional level of engagement. But then there's that energetic level of engagement where we can recognize, oh, I am hooked into this person in this way. And this engagement energetically says that these are our roles and this is our behavior with each other. And so to consciously be able to dissolve that and let a new engagement or a redefining of our engagement happen. And, a very simple way to do this on your own is to just think about it. You can think about your relationship with your parent and you're going to feel it in your body somewhere, and to trust your intuition, to know that you're going to feel it, and you can actually bring your hands right there to that place. And when you're thinking about okay, I have been the adult child and my parent has been the parent, and now this is changing. Where does that live in my body? And your hands will go right there. And what you can do is actually take your hand and you can just slide it down your body and think in your mind's eye and using your intention to say, okay, I'm releasing this engagement. And so, the pinky edge of your hand, if you will, sliding down the front of your body is actually releasing that cord of engagement. And then what happens is we become available to redefine what our engagement is in our new way that we're going to have to interface with our parent. And that can be followed up with doing some journaling exercises or taking a walk out in nature. And perhaps if, you're wherever you are, you could pick up a stone or a stick and you can just, honor that relationship by using your breath to blow in the honoring into that stone or that stick. You can bury it in the ground. You can throw it in running water. You could do it at home where you could blow it into a toothpick and you can burn it. And what this kind of thing does is it offers us a ceremony and a ritual to recognize and mark the change. And when we think about it, Kirsten, our society, we have so many rituals in ceremony. Right? I mean, graduation ceremony is ceremony and ritual. Sweet 16 birthday parties are ceremony and ritual. Weddings are ceremony and ritual. Funerals are ceremony and ritual. And birthday parties are ceremony and ritual. And so there's so many places where we have created ceremony and ritual, because what does it do? It's marking an event. Anniversary parties, ceremony and ritual. We're marking an event. We're saying, time has passed. We're in a new way of being. And so this also is ceremony and ritual, to mark that something has shifted, something is changing. And so to bring ceremony and ritual to it brings deep honoring. And when we step into ceremony and ritual, it actually moves us out of our limbic brain into our neocortex, into a different region of our brain, where we step into a different state of relatability and consciousness. And so, my experience in the work that I do has been that it has been profoundly beneficial for people who, in those moments, can recognize what's happening and then bring some ceremony and ritual and intention to recognizing and honoring that there's a shift that's taking place. And that what we did with your son was ceremony and ritual to mark his claiming, and where he stepped in and said, hey guys, we're doing this different now, right? I'm an adult man.
I think the power in those ceremonies is so important. While you were talking, I was thinking of something that we do in our family that actually accidentally is doing what you're talking about. But we do something called gate celebrations.
Right.
And each of us in our family, I remember it came about. It had nothing to do with my mom. It had to do with one of my kids, and they were in high school. I think it was my son. Both of my older kids were very, very good soccer players, and I think it was my son who got on the Utah Olympic development team, the soccer Olympic development team. And we heard about this, and I was like, honey, my gosh, this is so amazing, and congratulations. And he said, yeah, but that doesn't mean I'm on any kind of official team. It's just the development team. And I was like, as his mom, I was like, wait, what are we doing? Are we waiting until you've arrived to celebrate anything? Or are we celebrating the big milestones that get us possibly to the end that we're looking for, or possibly not to the end we're looking for? And so at that moment as a parent, I was like, we need to start honoring. I'm so sad it took me that long as a parent to figure it out, but to start honoring those moments where any one of us feels like you have changed your relationship to either a job or an academic pursuit, or in this case, a physical pursuit that he'd gotten on this team. And so we started doing what we called a gate celebration, where you've walked through a gate that was previously closed. You've walked through it. So we now are recognizing those incremental changes in our lives versus just the arrival at the end, because technically we all know as adults, we get to the end, we think it's the be all end all. We've been working our whole lives to try to afford our own house. We afford our own house, we buy it, we walk in the front door, and as soon as you walk in the front door, the dishwasher breaks, and you're like, wait, what? And so, if we are arriving at that perfect end house that we always dreamed of once we owned it, we realize, wait, there's a gate we've walked through, but there's no perfect house at the end of it. And with a parent, it's like we've walked through a gate, but we're just moving into a new form of relating.
Yes.
So it's
a new form of relating. It's exactly, it's the recognition and the honoring of that. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, I love it. It's so awesome. And thank you for sharing how we can bring that into our lives. And perhaps what you had taught me as we had our relationship moved into my parenting style, as I was hearing a child who had walked through an amazing gate and who wasn't thinking that it was worthy of some kind of celebration because it wasn't the end yet. He wasn't on the Olympic team yet,
Yeah.
Well, anything else you'd want to add? Because I think we're going to take a break and come back with a wine that I've selected to go with our discussion today, so that the wine lovers out there can have an interesting perspective on a new wine to try.
Yes. I would say that it's, again, these are things that are hard to recognize in the moment sometimes. And through our discussions and our conversations, and I know you and I, Kirsten, have talked a lot about this, may our topics and our discussions that we bring through our podcast begin to plant seeds and begin to open up to that place of recognizing things as they're happening. And to, what I would say for this particular topic where we're talking about recognizing different engagements, let's not just save it for when we hit that point with our elderly parent, but I would say to all our listeners to recognize that what we're talking about applies across the board, that our relationships with people go through their growth phases and their shifts and their changes all the time. And that this process of redefining our engagements, recognizing when one old way of engaging is no longer in play and another new engagement needs to come along. This same process applies of feeling it in our body, being able to use our hand to move down right along our body and release old engagements and to let new engagements come in and then to honor that shift. A really super simple example is to recognize when we do not parent our teenagers the same way we parented them when they were 2 years old, right? All of us who are parents, we can kind of go, yep, a 16-year-old doesn't need what a 2-year-old needs. But we also have to allow ourselves to grow into recognizing that we have to parent our 16-year-old the way that 16-year-old needs to be parented. And if we parented them like they were 2, it would be a disservice. And so that's an easy, blatant example to wrap our brains around. Where it gets trickier is when it's in the subtleties. In the subtleties of recognizing our relationships are morphing and changing. The subtleties of recognizing, wow, my relationship with my older parent is shifting. I'm doing a lot more of the, okay, Mom, you need this, this, and this before we leave the house today, right? And so to begin to develop our awareness of when relationships are changing. And it's a super, super healthy practice to do even within spousal partnership relationships. I do that with my partner. There's no set time. Like I don't have it on a timer. Like every 6 months I look at this, but I will tell you that within the years that I've been with him, I have recognized where our relationships have gone through their growth phases. And in those moments that I recognize it, I do dissolve old ways that we have engaged together, and I allow our new engagements to come into form so that our relationship continues to grow. It doesn't get held in this one train track that says this is how we always relate with each other. And that keeps the availability for longevity in the relationship alive. You and I both know, Kirsten, that life can, there are no guarantees, but the availability for longevity exists.
Love it, Dannielle. All right, guys, stay tuned. Thank you so much for all that information, Dannielle. It's so helpful in life. And stay tuned, you guys. I've got a very helpful wine you may want to consider that is chosen based on this topic.
Next up, Kirsten's choice for a wine to open after the show.
If you have a friend who calls you and is crying and who needs some support from long distance, consider sending a gift from Uplift Gift. These are curated, beautiful packages of comforting items that will take care of your friend if you can't be there in person. Uplift Gift, when words aren't enough.
Now, what wine will Kirsten choose for your table tonight? Here she is.
All right, guys, welcome back to our third segment of the show, and probably in this season, one of the more fun parts of the shows. Although we're learning some amazing skills that can be incorporated into much more than, taking care of an elderly parent or grandparent, and that certainly learning to adjust to new relationships and really voicing them and then being more at peace with them is really a nice way to live a life versus constantly fighting the changes that come in naturally to relationships. So,
Right.
so I have chosen a wine today that is paired to the fear of losing independence that we are focusing on today. That feeling of being, like Dannielle talked about, being on one track, and the fact that we are, especially as Americans, it is steeped in our society, it's steeped in our upbringing, that independence is a very sought after and hard won concept for the way we live. And the fact is, as we get older, we lose some of that. So I decided to compare the loss of independence to the difference between old world wines and new world wines. And as we've talked about wine before, I don't think I've ever talked about it in this way. So when you are focusing on old world versus new world, first let me define that. So old world means it's where vines and Vitis vinifera is the actual species we're talking about. Vitis vinifera is the wine grapes that generally we know, like Cabernet, Chardonnay, Merlot, all of those. There are other types of species, but in this case, it's Vitis vinifera. And those have been growing in Europe for thousands of years. So when we talk about old world wines, we are talking about European countries: France, Italy, Spain, Germany, Greece. Those are really the 5 old world countries that have had grapes growing for thousands of years, that are the specific Vitis vinifera grapes. Now, we've had grapes growing here, for example, in America, in the United States, for thousands of years as well, but they are not the grape varietals that make wines that are as pleasant to taste as the Vitis vinifera is from Europe. There are definitely grapes that grow here, but they are different species, and they are maybe genus. I'm not sure on species and genus, but regardless, they have qualities that happen when you ferment them that aren't very attractive as a drink. They're not as attractive as Vitis vinifera. So, old world, European countries: France, Italy, Spain, Germany, and Greece. Now when we talk about old world, they are on one track, man. Those old world wines are steeped in tradition. They're steeped in restrictions. They're steeped in rules. Those vintners that are making those wines, for the most part, in those old world countries, are following hundreds of years old rules. They're only allowed to plant specific types of grape varietals. They'll only be able to keep the grapes on the vines X number of days. They have to harvest during a certain spell. They can only harvest a certain yield of a number of pounds of grapes per acre. They are restricted as to what kind of aging they use. I mean, it is like rule after rule after rule. Like Dannielle was talking about, the train is on the track. Everyone knows when the train will be there. Everyone knows what the stops will be. And it is a prescribed course of action. So then we compare it to New World wines. And what happened was, about 400 years ago, from when we're talking about this today, 400 years ago or so, people started emigrating out of the countries, those European countries. And some of the things they would bring with them were their vines. And so, I mean, literally, you had grandma's, soup tureen and a rocking chair from the family, and you brought your vines on the boat with you because those were so a part of your lives as you were moving to a new country. And so the New World countries were where those emigrants landed. So we're talking about the US, we're talking about Australia, New Zealand, Chile, Argentina, South Africa, and they were bringing these vines with them. And so what happened was, as these people emigrated, and there was no rule overseeing body in Chile or Argentina or South Africa at the beginning of when these vines arrived with their hosts. And so these people had no rules they had to follow. So what happened in these New World countries was that there weren't the prescriptions. They were on completely different train tracks based on what they wanted to do in that area and the vines they brought and the countries they were from and what they were used to. And then they were free to do whatever they wanted. And so with that, it very, very clearly mimics what a normal American, for example, goes through in their lives in terms of the freedom of what they want to accomplish. And then what happens as they start having to get back on a track that maybe we've never been on in our lives. We've never been on that prescription. There's just one track and you have to get off at these different stops. So what I decided to do is pair our discussion today to a New World wine that really is a New World wine because it's a made up grape that someone decided to make a hybrid, which meant he took, this is back in the early 1900s, and this is in South Africa. And there was a gentleman there, and I don't have his name. We're not going to talk about his specific name, but he took two grapes, a hybrid, and he spliced them together. And he took a Pinot Noir plant, and he took what's called a Sansot plant. But back in the day, in the early 1900s, it was called an Hermitage grape. Okay, so Sansot is literally the exact same name as the same plant as Hermitage. Hermitage. So he takes these and he splices them together, okay? He makes a new Vitis vinifera type of plant that is a hybrid of these two grapes. So then as he was just a dude experimenting. He was a professor and he lived at a house and that the university was paying for. And so he moved. He moved when he got a new job, and he had these 4 plants that he had made them hybrids. And this student of his knew about the hybrid plants, and the university had sent a crew in to this. The house was vacant because this guy had left, and this was in his backyard. And they were like going to clean up the old weeds and things that were growing. Well, one of his students came and protected the 4 plants, these 4 hybrids, and they were like, we want to grow, we want to keep these. And so this is where a grape varietal called Pinotage came from. It's a Pinot Noir plus an Hermitage, which is also Sansot, which is a classic. Both of these grapes classically grew in France. And so Pinotage is this interesting hybrid that is, it has all of these smoky flavorings and aromas to it. Smoky. It's almost got almost a bramble, a pine kind of aroma. It's earthy, and it's got this like almost ripeness. It's almost like, it's almost like the difference between, maybe someone who's a cleanly, fully showered, person, and someone who may have been working in the fields for a couple days without a shower. It's got this ripeness to it, and 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 that might turn people off. Which, by the way, you either love Pinotage or you hate Pinotage. It is one of those grapes that very rarely has someone go, it's kind of an okay grape. I'll drink it now and then. It's like love it or hate it because of that earthy, ripe smells that it gives. But I will tell you, when I am drinking, when I'm having a smoked brisket or a pulled pork or any of that deeply smoky barbecue, is so awesome with that. So I'm going to recommend a Pinotage to pair with this. And specifically today, I've chosen the Mann family wines. Mann, M-A-N, standing for Marie, Annette, and Nikki, the wives of the men who, so these they named their winery after their wives' initials, because the men are the ones that really love this, but they love their wives. So anyway, Mann Family Winery, they have a Pinotage. You guys, it's like $12 nationally, and it's very well made, and it's something you can experiment with. Get that interesting smoke, red berries, mocha kind of flavoring on your wine, and try it with smoky foods. That's what I do with all of my smoky foods. So with that, I'm going to highlight our next episode. I'm going to say that
I have a question, Kirsten.
Please.
Where in the liquor store do you find a Pinotage? Where would I go? Would I go to the Pinot section? Would I go to what section? You know how liquor stores are? Yeah.
Good question. I would say generally most liquor stores that have a relatively good selection of wines may have either an imported section or a South African section. I would start there, and then if they don't have that, I would ask them, because it could be buried, especially with not knowing if people even understand, if the guy that receives the shipment might not even understand what a Pinotage is, because it's so much of a rare grape that we don't see much here. He might or she might put it in, like you're saying, in the Pinot section, and you just don't know. So either start in South Africa or imports, and if you can't find it there, ask. So good question, Dannielle. Wow, love it. Okay, moving ahead. We are going to talk next week about the loss of independence, but in the sense when the elderly person and the family can get ahead of it. Like I was fortunate enough to have my mom, who is a very proactive, pragmatic woman who was able to get ahead of her decline from dementia, which allowed us not to be in an emergency situation. How does the experience change for both the elderly person and the family? How do the family dynamics change? And how is it perhaps a more dignified, easier path than when we have the emergency situation that we dealt with today? So that's next episode. Thank you so much, you guys, for listening. We're so happy to have you here participating in this ongoing, interesting, yet somewhat challenging season we're doing. And hopefully you've got wonderful family around you at whatever time of year it is when you're listening. And we will look forward to seeing you next episode when we talk about a little bit easier track on this loss of independence. All right, thanks for joining Wines and Wonders.
We look forward to sharing a new story and wine with you next time. Thanks for tuning in to Wines and Wonders.